You've felt it before, that strange moment when someone smiles at you, talks kindly, even supports you, yet something underneath feels tense, like the energy doesn't match the words, and later that tension turns into distance, subtle competition, or quiet coldness that leaves you replaying conversations in your head, wondering what you did wrong. And here's the truth most emotionally aware people never hear. Your calm, your confidence, your empathy, and your emotional intelligence don't just attract connection, they also activate discomfort in people who are avoiding their own growth. And today you're going to understand exactly why that happens, how deep psychology explains it, and how to protect your energy without becoming hard, closed off, or emotionally unavailable. Because once you recognize this pattern, you stop blaming yourself and start moving through relationships with clarity instead of confusion. And what you're about to realize next might completely change how you see the people who stay close to you. Empaths don't attract people who secretly resent them because they are weak or because they try too hard. They attract them because emotional awareness creates contrast, and contrast makes unresolved feelings visible, even when no one is pointing them out. And when someone who avoids self-reflection stands next to someone who understands emotions, boundaries, and self-regulation, it creates an unspoken comparison that the mind doesn't want to face. And Carl Jung explained this as the shadow, the part of the personality that holds insecurity, envy, and unrealized potential, the part people don't like to look at. And when you walk into a room with stability, clarity, and confidence, that shadow doesn't disappear. It gets activated, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in subtle emotional reactions that feel confusing. Because on the surface, the person may admire you, feel inspired by you, even depend on you, yet at the same time feel irritated, competitive, or uncomfortable without knowing why. And that emotional contradiction is where attraction slowly turns into tension, and tension looks for a way out, but not in honest conversations, in small shifts of behavior that are easy to deny and hard to explain. And this is why empathic people often sense something changing long before anything is said, because emotional awareness doesn't just notice actions, it notices energy, tone, and motivation. And once you sense that shift, a quiet question starts forming in your mind, and it sounds like this: why does it feel like the more I grow, the more complicated this connection becomes? At first, the relationship feels positive and energizing, because the other person is drawn to what you represent: emotional safety, encouragement, perspective, and presence. And you naturally offer those things, because empathy is not something you switch on and off. It's part of how you move through the world. You listen, you support, you reassure, you help them make sense of their feelings, and for a while that dynamic feels meaningful, even powerful. But over time something shifts, because your growth doesn't stop, your boundaries strengthen, your self-respect increases, your life starts moving forward. And now your presence is no longer just comforting, it becomes a reminder of what they haven't done yet, what they've been postponing, what they've been avoiding. And instead of using that awareness as motivation, the mind looks for relief, and the easiest relief is comparison. And comparison quietly turns into resentment when someone feels left behind. And the hardest part is that they may not even realize this is happening. They just start feeling less supportive, less warm, less open, and you feel the emotional temperature drop without any clear reason. And that's when you start trying harder, because empaths often believe tension means they need to fix something, explain something, or soften something about themselves. And without realizing it, you start managing the emotional comfort of people who are uncomfortable with your growth. What makes this pattern so powerful is that resentment doesn't always show up as hostility. Sometimes it shows up as dependence, because some people stay close not because they feel equal, but because your emotional strength helps them regulate their own feelings. Your stability becomes their safety net, your clarity becomes their guidance system, and as long as you are carrying emotional weight for both of you, the imbalance feels manageable. But the moment you begin standing fully in your confidence, the emotional support they were relying on starts to feel unavailable. And that creates anxiety, and anxiety looks for a target. And instead of turning inward and building their own emotional skills, they unconsciously direct that discomfort outward. And that's when comments start sounding sharper, encouragement becomes quieter, and support feels conditional. And because you are emotionally aware, you sense that shift immediately, and you begin questioning yourself again. wondering if you're being too distant, too confident, too focused on your own path. And this is where many empaths get trapped, because they start shrinking to preserve emotional harmony, lowering their excitement, softening their wins, hiding parts of themselves that might trigger discomfort. And for a while that seems to work. The tension eases, the connection feels calmer, but something inside you starts feeling heavy, because now you're not just carrying their emotions, you're suppressing your own expansion. And that internal pressure builds quietly until one day you realize you're tired, not of caring, but of constantly adjusting to stay accepted. This is the moment most people misunderstand, because they think the pain comes from losing the connection. But the deeper pain comes from realizing how much of yourself you minimized to keep it. And when that awareness hits, everything starts to look different. You notice how often you were the one initiating, supporting, encouraging, and explaining. You notice how rarely the emotional energy flowed back in the same way. And you start to understand that the relationship wasn't built on shared growth. It was built on emotional imbalance. And once you see that, resentment no longer feels mysterious, it feels predictable. Because when one person grows and the other avoids growth, emotional distance is inevitable. And instead of blaming yourself for that distance, you begin seeing it as information. Information about where you are being valued versus where you are being used as emotional support. And that awareness doesn't make you cold, it makes you selective. And selection is not rejection, it is alignment. It is choosing environments where your emotional intelligence is not something others quietly compete with, but something that fits naturally into the dynamic. As this shift happens, something else changes that most people don't expect. You stop attracting relationships that feel emotionally heavy, not because you became less empathetic, but because you stopped offering your energy to situations that require you to shrink. And now your presence no longer creates pressure, it creates resonance. And people who are comfortable with self-reflection, accountability, and growth start entering your life not because they need your light to survive, but because they already have their own. And connection becomes mutual instead of draining, supportive instead of tense, and peaceful instead of confusing. And you begin realizing that the earlier resentment you experienced was never about your personality. It was about emotional timing, about meeting people at different stages of self-awareness. And not every stage is compatible. And that doesn't mean anyone is wrong, it just means not everyone is meant to walk the same path at the same pace. And trying to force that alignment only creates emotional friction. What changes everything is when you finally stop interpreting emotional discomfort as something you must fix and start seeing it as a signal guiding you toward healthier environments. Because emotional intelligence is not just about understanding others, it's about honoring your own emotional experience. And once you do that, resentment loses its power over you. Because you are no longer standing in spaces where your growth feels threatening. You are standing in spaces where growth is normal, encouraged, and shared. And that is when your relationships begin supporting your future, instead of pulling you back into old emotional patterns. And you realize that empathy does not mean staying where you are misunderstood. And kindness does not mean sacrificing your own momentum. And emotional awareness does not mean carrying what others refuse to face. If you've ever felt confused by people pulling away when you were finally becoming more confident, more grounded, and more clear about who you are, now you know that your growth was not the problem. It was simply revealing which connections were built on shared strength and which were built on emotional dependence. And the moment you stop shrinking to protect other people's comfort, your life begins opening to relationships that match your emotional depth instead of competing with it. And the next step is simple but powerful. Start noticing how you feel after interactions, whether you feel expanded or drained, supported or responsible. Because your emotional system already knows what your mind has been trying to explain. And the more you trust that signal, the faster your environment begins to change. And if this connected with you, thank you for staying with me until the end. That tells me you are someone who is ready for clarity, growth, and emotionally healthy connections. And if you want more content like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. Because the next message might be exactly what you need for the next level of your journey.